An old Ayrshire story tells of how in feudal times an innocent man was hanged in a Scottish baron court simply as a demonstration to a visitor of how hanging was done. That's just one of the countless abuses of justice that have taken place in all parts of the world and which probably still take place to this day. Such a thing would be extremely unlikely, though, in a modern democracy today, although travesties of justice do occur. But most of us in the West believe that we are safe from such abuses of authority. In fact, we take this for granted. We think it's because we're civilised kind of people who wouldn't tolerate such things. And this is partly true. But it's not just because we have this civilised behaviour in our genes. It's because our ancestors fought for their rights. Human rights should never be taken for granted. But what are human rights? And how did they come about? According to the online Encyclopaedia Britannica, the expression human rights is relatively new, having come into everyday parlance only since the Second World War, with the development of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Actually, that's not only untrue, but quite misleading. Human rights were mentioned long before 1945. The author Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave in the United States and managed to escape to become an abolitionist and social reformer, described in his 1845 autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, how, while still a slave, he secretly learned to read and became inspired by the concept of human rights. Douglass read a book called The Columbian Orator, a collection of essays and speeches, and it included a speech by the Anglo-Irish playwright and politician Richard Brinsley Butler Sheridan. In his autobiography, Frederick Douglass wrote, "What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights." The concept of rights became increasingly important during the Enlightenment period of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. Before the 18th century, Europe was ruled by kingdoms and principalities and the church. Priests interpreted the Bible, and this gave them considerable power, which was often abused. Heretics were burned at the stake for questioning religious doctrine, and women who were suspected of being witches were burned or drowned. The invention of the printing press in the 1450s allowed more people to read the Bible for themselves. It also facilitated the spread of ideas and various philosophies, different ways of looking at life. People started questioning religion and questioning the way that they were governed. In the 16th century, Protestantism challenged the power of the Catholic Church. And even when Protestantism became the established church in England and Scotland, religious persecution continued. One of the most famous persecuted groups left England for the Netherlands in the early 1600s and then sailed across the Atlantic in the Mayflower to establish the colony of New England. In the later 1600s, Quakers were persecuted. Quakers are a religious group who hold meetings for worship without an appointed priest or minister. George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, was imprisoned several times, and Margaret Fell, who became his wife, was arrested and imprisoned after failing to take an oath and for allowing Quaker meetings to take place in her home. Margaret argued for equality of the sexes in her pamphlet, Women Speaking Justified, which she wrote while in prison. On her release after 4 years in prison, she was imprisoned again for breaking the Conventicle Act, which forbade religious assemblies of more than 5 people outside the Church of England. In Scotland, hundreds of Presbyterian Covenanters were executed for breaking this act, and for their belief that the king was not the head of the church, as only God could be the head of the church. In 1688, King James II of England, James VII of Scotland, fled to France and William of Orange was installed as king in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. The following year, the Bill of Rights was proclaimed, asserting the rights of Parliament, free elections, and the prohibition of torture or cruel and unusual punishments. This bill became a model for the United States Bill of Rights almost 100 years later. In 1789, the publication of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen heralded the start of the French Revolution. The monarchy was overthrown and feudalism was abolished. However, these rights did not explicitly extend to women, and 2 years later, in 1791, the celebrated playwright Olympe de Gouges published the Declaration of the Rights of Women and of the Female Citizen. This may have been an influence on the British writer and philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, who published a vindication of the rights of women the following year. Olympe de Gouges also campaigned against slavery in the French colonies, and she spoke out against violence. Her writings eventually led to her arrest as the French Revolution turned into the Terror, and she was sent to the guillotine in 1793. The French Revolution inspired many other revolutions and revolutionary campaigns, and by the end of the 19th century, most individuals in Europe had more individual freedom of speech and religion than their ancestors. But in the 20th century, the spectre of totalitarianism raised its ugly head. The Nazis came to power in democratic elections in Germany in 1933, and they persecuted and killed millions for their race and religion. In Russia, Stalin's Great Purge of the 1930s saw more than 1 million people imprisoned in forced labour camps and some 700,000 executions on suspicion of supporting Trotsky or other political rivals. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted at the United Nations General Assembly to enshrine the rights and freedoms of all human beings, following the violations of human rights perpetrated by the Nazis in the Soviet Union under Stalin. The European Convention of Human Rights followed in the same year, and in 1959 the European Court of Human Rights was established in Strasbourg in France. In 1998, the European Convention was incorporated into UK domestic law. The European Convention on Human Rights, which is not part of the EU, is an agreement to protect the right to life, freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, the right to liberty, the right to a fair trial, the right not to be punished for something that wasn't against the law at the time, the right to respect for family and private life, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to marry and start a family, the right not to be discriminated against in respect of these rights, the right to protection of property, the right to education, the right to participate in free elections, the abolition of the death penalty. Many of these rights are considered to be natural or God-given. No one can give you your rights. They are considered to be inalienable, inviolable. Over the years, rights were declared in order to hold power to account, to set the boundaries beyond which no leader, however powerful, could cross without condemnation and the threat of revolution. But a public consultation on a new human rights bill for Scotland seems to turn a lot of this on its head. It appears to be using the concept of human rights to validate ideals which are not human rights at all. Ideals such as a healthy environment or sustainable food, which may well be worth aspiring to, but which are far too vague and widely open to interpretation to be seen as rights. On top of this, the bill aims to impose enforcement mechanisms to ensure that these so-called rights are complied with. This suggests to me that the effect would be to use the concept of human rights more as a lever of control than to hold power to account. It seems to twist and distort the whole meaning of human rights. In the next and final part in this series, I'm going to run through the public consultation for this bill to highlight how it distorts the concept of human rights, using their emotive power and importance to ease the way for potentially unprecedented new powers for authority that could enable the government and other institutions to control us in the name of human rights. Thanks for watching.